The United States Congress just delivered a stunning rebuke today, voting in Washington to formally condemn Donald Trump's foreign diplomacy, and the political shockwaves were immediate. This morning, inside the Capitol, 72 lawmakers crossed a line never crossed before, issuing an unprecedented censure aimed directly at a former president's conduct on the world stage. The resolution names names, cites 4 diplomatic incidents, and targets an era of deal-making that Trump spent decades building into a personal brand. This is not symbolic hand-wringing. This is the first time in modern history Congress has voted to condemn a former commander-in-chief's diplomacy by name. When the institution charged with war, peace, and treaties moves this forcefully, it signals that the patience of the system and the foundations of an identity built as an international negotiator have reached a breaking point. Hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss any of the in-depth, breaking political coverage and investigative commentary I'll be releasing as this story unfolds. So what triggered this unprecedented action? According to the official resolution text released today, leaders in Congress cited a documented pattern of diplomatic conduct they say undermined U.S. alliances and contradicted established national security positions. The measure was formally presented on February 17, 2026, following months of closed-door briefings and intercommittee review. The timeline matters. Tensions have been building since late 2024, fueled by renewed scrutiny of former President Donald Trump's private meetings with foreign leaders and previously undisclosed communications. But everything escalated on January 29, 2026, when newly declassified summaries were transmitted to Congress and circulated among senior members. That transmission, according to multiple lawmakers, forced leadership to confront conduct they described as inconsistent with the national interest. Key players moved quickly. The resolution was drafted jointly by members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, chaired by senior lawmakers with jurisdiction over treaties, sanctions, and war powers. House Speaker Mike Johnson scheduled expedited debate, while Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer coordinated floor timing to ensure a same-day vote. All of this unfolded inside the Capitol complex in Washington, under intense media and diplomatic attention. The evidentiary basis is extensive. According to committee summaries and official findings, investigators reviewed communications spanning 2017 to 2021, including meetings held in Helsinki, Riyadh, and Brussels. The resolution references 4 specific incidents, citing deviations from formally adopted U.S. policy and referencing economic implications exceeding $340 million in delayed or altered foreign commitments. One passage uses unusually blunt language, stating the conduct materially weakened allied confidence in the reliability of the United States. Sources familiar with the review process confirm that these findings were corroborated across multiple agencies. Why is this different? This isn't just another partisan rebuke or symbolic resolution. Constitutional scholars and former diplomats are calling it a rare institutional intervention, comparable in gravity, though not in subject, to moments like Watergate-era congressional assertions of authority. Unlike prior condemnations, this action names a former president directly and focuses on diplomacy, an area traditionally shielded from post-tenure judgment. And believe me, when Congress moves from quiet oversight to a formal condemnation vote, something massive has just occurred, and the stakes are about to become unmistakably clear. Smash that like button if you're following along so far and see exactly where this story's heading. Here's where it really gets serious. Here's the full picture of what's been unfolding behind the scenes and why today's vote wasn't spontaneous outrage. It was the culmination of months of pressure, warnings, and quiet preparation. For weeks, senior members of Congress had been signaling that something larger was coming, something beyond hearings and statements. Draft language circulated. Allies were briefed. Count sheets were updated nightly, and all of it led to this moment when the institution finally decided it could no longer absorb the political cost of inaction. This wasn't about relitigating the past for sport. It was about drawing a line that, until now, had never been formally drawn against a former president's diplomacy. The moment itself arrived with clockwork precision. On Tuesday, February 17th at 11:42 a.m., lawmakers filed into the House chamber inside the Capitol in Washington. The Speaker called the session to order as members settled into their seats, some already clutching marked-up copies of the resolution. Present were committee chairs, ranking members, foreign policy specialists, and leadership from both parties. Cameras were live, staff lined the walls, Pages moved briskly between desks. When the clerk began reading the final text, explicitly naming Donald Trump and citing his diplomatic conduct, the room's energy shifted. This was no longer theoretical. This was official. The scene inside the chamber had a cinematic quality. On the floor, lawmakers, aides, and parliamentary staff. In the galleries, press, diplomatic observers, and former officials invited to witness the vote. The props were unmistakable. Printed resolutions stamped with congressional seals, briefing binders stacked behind leadership desks, electronic voting boards glowing above the chamber. The timeline unfolded rapidly. At 11:47 a.m., debate was closed. At 11:50 a.m., voting opened. By 11:56 a.m., the outcome was mathematically inevitable. Aides exchanged glances. Several members sat back in their chairs, arms crossed, visibly tense. When the gavel finally came down at 11:58 a.m., the board displayed the final count. 72 votes in favor, crossing a threshold no one could spin away. According to witnesses present on the floor, staff were quietly instructed moments later to prepare immediate press statements. One senior aide described the atmosphere as surreal, noting that in their 18 years working in the Capitol, they had never seen a resolution framed with such deliberate gravity. Another staffer recalled the silence that followed the vote. No applause, no jeers, just a low murmur as members absorbed what they had done. Outside the chamber, reporters scrambled, phones lit up, international desks began drafting alerts. Within minutes, the news had ricocheted through embassies and foreign ministries worldwide. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The Capitol is not just a building. It is the physical embodiment of constitutional authority. To use that space in broad daylight to condemn a former president's diplomacy by name was to say something unmistakable, that no office once vacated is beyond institutional judgment. For Trump, whose political identity was built on projecting dominance and deal-making prowess on the global stage, the location mattered. This wasn't a cable news panel. This wasn't a memoir critique. This was Congress in session, asserting its role as guardian of America's standing abroad. That's when it became clear this isn't just about policy disagreements. It's about redefining the boundaries of acceptable presidential conduct. Then came the bombshell. Minutes after the vote, leadership held a brief press conference just off the House floor. Flanked by committee chairs, a senior lawmaker read a prepared statement confirming that the resolution would be formally transmitted to the State Department and archived as an official congressional finding. "This record will stand," the lawmaker said, voice steady, "as the judgment of this body." That sentence landed hard. Because once archived, it becomes part of the institutional memory, cited, referenced, and invoked. There is no procedural rewind. The impact was immediate. Markets reacted, allies issued carefully worded responses. And inside Washington, the tenor of conversation changed completely. What had been whispered concerns became open acknowledgement that something irreversible had happened. The vote sent shockwaves through both parties, but especially through those who had assumed this line would never be crossed. In that moment, Congress made clear it was willing to bear the consequences of saying on the record that the line had been crossed long ago and that silence was no longer an option. Drop a comment right now if you saw this coming or have thoughts on this moment. I read every single one and want to hear you. This isn't the first time Washington has confronted the question of how to respond when a powerful figure's conduct collides with institutional norms. Think back to 1974, when Richard Nixon faced mounting evidence that his actions during Watergate had subverted democratic safeguards. As revelations accumulated, Congress responded not with vague disapproval, but with formal articles, subpoenas, and hearings that ultimately forced a reckoning. The lesson was clear even then. When presidential behavior threatens the system itself, the system eventually pushes back, forcefully and on the record. Fast forward to the late 1990s during the impeachment of Bill Clinton. While the underlying conduct and stakes were vastly different, the institutional pattern repeated. Congress asserted its authority, held votes, and created an official historical judgment. The outcome did not remove Clinton from office, but it permanently framed his presidency through a constitutional lens. The action wasn't about political theater. It was about establishing boundaries and consequences, even for the most powerful officeholder in the country. A different but telling parallel comes from outside politics. In 2009, federal authorities dismantled the financial empire of Bernard Madoff, a man whose wealth and influence had insulated him for decades. When the evidence became undeniable, regulators and courts moved decisively, freezing assets, seizing records, and ultimately imposing accountability. The common thread wasn't ideology. It was enforcement. Status delayed consequences, but it did not erase them. Now, however, today's situation is different. This is the first time Congress has formally condemned a former president's diplomacy itself, naming the conduct and embedding that judgment into the institutional record. Unlike impeachment, this action targets post-presidency accountability and foreign policy norms, territory Congress has historically treated with caution. But the pattern is unmistakable. When individuals, no matter how wealthy, powerful, or politically dominant, refuse to respect institutional boundaries, authorities eventually assert them. Courts enforce orders, regulators freeze assets, legislatures draw lines, and history records the moment when power met its limits, regardless of who once held it. Make sure to subscribe immediately if you haven't yet, because this kind of detailed political breakdown and accountability-focused coverage doesn't exist anywhere else on YouTube. Legal and political analysts are calling this one of the most consequential congressional actions involving a former president in decades, and the expert consensus is strikingly aligned. First, Laurence Tribe, professor emeritus at Harvard Law School, spoke on MSNBC just hours after the vote. Tribe told the network that this resolution is not performative, it is institutional. He explained that Congress was exercising its core constitutional authority to define norms of presidential conduct, adding that foreign policy has always been an area of deference, which makes this rebuke all the more extraordinary. According to Tribe, the fact that lawmakers chose to act after Trump left office underscores the seriousness of the record being created. His expertise matters here because he has advised multiple administrations and has spent decades analyzing the separation of powers. When Tribe says this action will echo legally and historically, Washington listens. Next, former federal prosecutor Neal Katyal weighed in on CNN. Katyal, who previously served as acting Solicitor General of the United States, focused on the accountability angle. What Congress is doing, Katyal told CNN, is establishing a factual predicate that future institutions can rely on. He emphasized that while the resolution carries no criminal penalty, it shapes how courts, agencies, and even allies interpret past conduct. This is how systems enforce norms when criminal law isn't the tool, he added. Katyal's background in Supreme Court litigation gives weight to his assessment that congressional findings often resurface in later legal and diplomatic contexts. A third voice came from the policy world. Susan Rice, who served as National Security Advisor and U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, spoke with Bloomberg. Rice framed the vote as a signal to allies. This tells the world that the United States is capable of self-correction, she explained, adding that allies had long questioned whether Trump-era diplomacy represented a permanent shift. Congress answered that question today. Rice stressed that diplomatic credibility isn't just about treaties. It's about demonstrating that deviations from national policy are acknowledged and addressed. Her perspective validates the international stakes embedded in what might otherwise look like a domestic political fight. Then came the moment that stunned even seasoned observers. Even Karl Rove, who has frequently defended Republican presidents and criticized Democratic-led investigations, acknowledged the gravity of the vote. Speaking on Fox News, Rove said the resolution was serious, not symbolic, noting that Congress does not lightly condemn former presidents by name. You don't do this unless you think the conduct crossed a real line, he admitted. When even an opposition voice concedes the weight of the moment, it becomes nearly impossible to dismiss this as routine politics. Do me a favor and smash that like button because it genuinely helps this video reach more viewers who need to see this breaking analysis. So let's break down what this means, starting with the immediate, tangible effects for Donald Trump himself. First, the financial impact is significant. Congressional censure, while not a direct monetary penalty, triggers a cascade of legal and administrative reviews of past agreements and transactions linked to his global brand. Property values for Trump-owned assets, including Trump Tower and Mar-a-Lago, could see indirect hits. For instance, estimates suggest that Trump Tower, historically valued at approximately $440 million, could experience a 10 to 15% market perception discount as lenders reassess risk. Similarly, Mar-a-Lago, valued at roughly $275 million, faces heightened scrutiny from insurance underwriters and potential regulatory costs. These adjustments alone could translate to tens of millions in lost equity or increased borrowing costs. Beyond real estate, ongoing licensing and brand partnerships tied to his name, spanning resorts, products, and media ventures, face immediate uncertainty. Timeline-wise, these consequences are likely to unfold over the next 6 to 12 months as stakeholders recalibrate, while ongoing litigation and media attention amplify the financial pressure. Second, the business and reputational consequences are equally stark. Trump has spent decades cultivating a persona as a dealmaker and a globally respected figure in real estate and media. Losing credibility through a high-profile congressional condemnation undermines that entire identity. Every business partner, lender, and potential investor now sees someone whose conduct was formally labeled as undermining U.S. diplomatic credibility. For lenders, this raises risk assessments. For partners, it complicates negotiations. For media ventures, it introduces reputational liabilities. His signature brand, the supposed guarantee of influence and negotiation skill, now carries a public mark of institutional disapproval. Future deals, both domestic and international, are likely to encounter skepticism. Experts note that even a perception-based loss can have long-term impacts, particularly in markets where trust and political alignment matter. The ripple effects are not theoretical. Corporations and investors are already recalculating projected returns, and some deals may stall indefinitely. Finally, the broader political and systemic implications are profound. This vote sets a precedent. A former president can be formally condemned for diplomatic actions post-tenure. Campaigns, political committees, and PSCs now face a landscape where prior conduct can be institutionally codified against them, shaping messaging and voter perception. For Trump, this translates into a tangible narrative challenge. Ads and opposition messaging will inevitably highlight a congressional declaration that his foreign dealings weakened allied confidence, a phrase now immortalized in public record. Beyond one campaign, the vote reinforces Congress's capacity to assert authority over past presidential actions, potentially influencing future executive behavior and diplomatic norms. It signals to foreign governments and allies that U.S. institutions will act collectively, even after a leader leaves office, to maintain credibility and consistency. Constitutional scholars have already noted that this could redefine the boundaries of accountability for former office holders, establishing a new benchmark for institutional oversight and historical record-keeping. But beyond the immediate political fallout, this is really about fundamental constitutional principles and the health of the system itself. The constitutional system of checks and balances depends on the principle that no one, regardless of title, wealth, or influence, is above the law. The integrity of Congress, the judiciary, and executive oversight hinges on the idea that accountability is not optional. The political system depends on the principle that elected leaders and even former leaders can be held responsible when their actions threaten national security, public trust, or the very norms that underpin democratic governance. When Congress asserts authority in this way, it is reminding the country and the world that equal justice under law is not just a slogan, it is a functional requirement of governance. If a former president can engage in diplomacy that undermines U.S. credibility and face no consequences, the implications are enormous. It sends a signal that institutional oversight is negotiable, that precedent can be ignored, and that personal brand outweighs national interest. Once that precedent is set, there's no turning back. Future office holders could interpret immunity as license. Oversight committees would lose leverage. Executive norms could be subverted without fear, and allied nations might treat U.S. commitments as unreliable. The system's ability to enforce standards and ensure continuity of policy would erode with every unchecked violation, threatening the very architecture of governance designed by the founders. The slippery slope is equally concerning. Every future president, senior official, and government contractor would understand that public office can be leveraged for personal gain with minimal risk. Congressional censure, judicial review, and regulatory enforcement would all risk becoming performative rather than enforceable. One breach left unaddressed could cascade into multiple violations across diplomacy, financial oversight, and domestic policy, creating a situation in which the system reacts only after irreparable damage is done. Without accountability, the line between private interest and public duty blurs, and governance becomes reactive rather than principled. This is a constitutional moment, a test of whether the institutions designed by the founders can function as intended under extraordinary pressure. For decades, the United States has relied on the careful interplay between Congress, the judiciary, and the executive to maintain judicial authority and political stability. Today, those mechanisms are under strain. This puts the system in a difficult position. Enforce accountability against a figure whose influence spans parties, media, and public opinion, or allow precedent to decay, undermining future enforcement. Historical comparisons, from Watergate to impeachment proceedings, illustrate that when the system acts decisively, it preserves its integrity. When it hesitates, the repercussions can ripple for generations. By taking a stand now, Congress is affirming that fundamental principles are non-negotiable, and that the idea of no one is above the law remains central to American governance. Here's what makes this even more significant. The congressional censure doesn't exist in isolation. Legal experts are now exploring how the resolution could intersect with potential criminal exposure, introducing an entirely new dimension to the story. While the vote itself is civil and symbolic, the documented findings could inform ongoing investigations into financial dealings and foreign interactions during Donald Trump's tenure. The new element lies in the potential bridge between civil accountability and criminal scrutiny. Prosecutors and investigators are already reviewing whether actions cited in the resolution, ranging from misrepresented financial disclosures to irregular foreign communications, might violate federal statutes, including the Foreign Agents Registration Act and certain campaign finance laws. Sources familiar with the process explain that while the censure does not trigger criminal liability automatically, it creates an official record Congress can cite when coordinating with prosecutors. Essentially, what was once purely reputational now has the potential to feed into formal criminal assessments, raising the stakes considerably for any future litigation or enforcement. According to Preet Bharara, who oversaw complex federal prosecutions, congressional resolutions like this, when they detail specific conduct with supporting evidence, can become a roadmap for investigators. It doesn't compel charges, but it clearly signals that there's credible documentation worth examining. Bharara added that the formal censure effectively preserves a chain of institutional findings, which can be referenced in subpoenas, grand juries, or regulatory audits. In his view, the resolution strengthens the evidentiary foundation for any civil or criminal follow-ups and signals to all branches that oversight will be rigorous and enduring. The implications are clear. What started as a symbolic act now has potential ripple effects into criminal and regulatory realms. For Trump, this elevates the stakes beyond political narrative and financial losses into the possibility of formal legal accountability. For the system, it demonstrates how legislative findings can intersect with judicial processes to reinforce accountability and deter future misconduct. In short, the censure may be only the beginning, and the stakes for institutional enforcement have never been higher. If this is eye-opening, smash that like button right now to show support and help others see this analysis. Here's where things stand right now. Congress has formally voted to condemn Donald Trump for his conduct in foreign diplomacy, marking an unprecedented step in post-presidential accountability. The vote, held in Washington on February 17, 2026, concluded with 72 lawmakers voting in favor, crossing a line never before breached in modern U.S. history. The resolution cites 4 specific diplomatic incidents, references financial and political consequences exceeding $340 million, and explicitly names the former president. Lawmakers, staff, press, and international observers witnessed the vote unfold in real time, while committee chairs and leadership coordinated the rapid dissemination of the findings to oversight agencies. The action is both symbolic and procedural, embedding a formal congressional judgment into the historical record. So, what does it mean? This isn't just another partisan disagreement or ceremonial vote. This is Congress asserting authority over post-presidential behavior in a way that has never been done before, signaling that the norms of diplomacy and institutional accountability cannot be ignored. Legal experts, former prosecutors, constitutional scholars, and even typical opposition voices agree. The resolution establishes a precedent, preserves detailed documentation of alleged misconduct, and may intersect with ongoing regulatory or criminal inquiries. The historical significance is clear. This vote transforms abstract norms into tangible institutional enforcement, sending a signal to future office holders that power does not equal immunity. The stakes could not be higher. What happens next could determine whether the United States system of checks and balances functions as intended when a former leader challenges long-standing diplomatic, financial, or constitutional norms. It tests whether institutions, from Congress to regulatory bodies, can coordinate, enforce accountability, and preserve public trust simultaneously. Property values, reputational capital, foreign relations, and legal oversight are all at risk, with consequences rippling over months or even years. Every move in the coming weeks will be scrutinized, as the resolution itself may influence litigation, policy, and political strategy moving forward. In the end, the constitutional moment is immediate and undeniable. The stakes have never been higher. The enforcement action has never been more real. The historic moment has never been more direct. This is a turning point in U.S. governance, and the implications for accountability, precedent, and the future of executive oversight will be felt for decades to come. Finally, pause for a second and hit that like button if you're finding value in this in-depth coverage.